Um, so in your book cover, The Bad Samaritan, there's a subtitle that says The Threat of Global Prosperity. And I asked my lecturer last year, because I did a course similar to this lecture, about what is this threat if the poor countries were to develop into capital-intensive and technology-intensive industries. And he said, well, it's kind of what we're hoping for, so he didn't see any problem in it, but like, I haven't read the book, but what's your side of the story?
Right. Well, I mean, the subtitle was invented by my publisher rather than myself. But basically, the point of that subtitle is that the developed countries are putting institutions and global rules in place that make the development of developing countries difficult. Because, for example, in launching the WTO, the World Trade Organizations, restrictions on what kind of industrial policies and trade policies countries can use have been tightened. Yeah? So some of the policies that were very widely used by many countries, like the so-called local contents requirement, requiring to the foreign companies that you have to source more than X% of your inputs locally, these are not allowed these days. Yeah? And the developed countries, for another example, we didn't have time to mention that, tighten rules on intellectual property rights. Yeah? So it has become more difficult for developing countries to import technologies, things like the reverse engineering. For example, a lot of developing countries did in the old days was to import machines, basically take it apart, make copies, put them together and produce their own version. These kind of things are much more difficult to do these days because of all the patents that are involved in that. Yeah? So yes, the point I was trying to make in the book was that despite the fact that they were using all these bad policies, the developed countries today have installed this global economic governance system in which those policies are not impossible, but very difficult to use. And that is a threat to development of developing countries and therefore threat to global prosperity.
So the creation of this global economic order, is it linked to the fact that these organizations, so there's the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank, that they are largely dominated by mainstream economics, and there are, as you mentioned at the end of the lecture, that it's because they don't want to admit that their theory is faulty, and then it must be the countries, or is there some more malign motivations behind the...
Right, no, it's a mixture of things. Well, for one thing, these two organizations, the World Bank and the IMF, I mean, they are not democratic. I mean, the decisions are made according to basically the share capital you have in that organization. Yeah? So it's run like a company. Yeah? So the Americans have 18.9% or something like that of the total share. I'm sure it's a pure coincidence, but all the main decisions require 85% majority. Yeah? So Americans can veto anything. Yeah? They cannot make others do what it wants, but it can veto what it doesn't want. Yeah? And the rich countries together control the majority of votes. Yeah? So basically, these organizations run according to the wishes of the rich countries. Now, what are the wishes of the rich countries? That's quite complex because part of it is a genuine kind of misperception. Yeah? These countries have started believing in their own myth and believe that the free trade, free market policy is actually what made them rich, and they want other countries to be able to use that. Yeah? So these people are imposing this policy thinking that they are doing a favor to the developing countries. Yeah? Another more sinister part of it is there's a lot of corporate interest in the rich countries that don't want the new competitors to emerge. Yeah? So they want developing countries to open their market as much as possible. Yeah? The intellectual part is, yes, more complicated. I mean, it's not just the World Bank and the IMF that is dominated by neoclassical economics. It's the whole the world economics profession. So without necessarily meaning to recruit only people who believe in free trade and free market, if you just naturally recruited people from good universities around the world, you will end up with a very high proportion of people who believe in free trade theory. So as a result, I mean, the mixture of misguided goodwill and corporate lobbying and the dominance of a particular type of economics all over the world produce this worldview and subsequently global institutions that create difficulties for developing countries to develop their economies.
If we accept this idea that the main reason, or at least one of the biggest reasons that some poor countries become rich countries or upper middle income countries and some don't, is policy difference, I just want to ask you, in the last 70 years, the number of countries that have made that move from poor countries to upper middle rich countries is a very small list, really. South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, it's not a big list. What do you think is the reason that these countries were able to do that, to make the correct policy choices, when so many countries have not been able to do that?
Well, I mean, there are two layers to this because one more kind of immediate reason is, not all protection is the same. I mean, you can use protectionism in a very destructive way. You can use it to promote the development. So one thing was that the successful countries designed their policies more cleverly. So they made it sure that the protectionism is not unconditional. So that there were performance requirements. You are getting protection within 10 years. You will have to face competition, or we can protect you further, but then you need to show that you have improved your performance. So I mean, it's just one tiny aspect of it, but I cannot go into that. But the point is that the policies were actually in detail quite different. Simple word protection doesn't cover everything. You could give 200% unconditional protection, which will be very destructive. You can have graduated protection, conditional performance. The effects of these two are very different. But at the deeper level, yes, I mean, in order to implement these policies, you need, the changes in the political arrangements and building of new political consensus. Now, I'm not enough of a political scientist to tell you how successfully you can do this, but when you look at the countries that have achieved this, you see that they, before making this takeoff, they all somehow realign the domestic interests to focus on developmentalist policies. So, for example, the East Asian countries had land reform that got rid of the landlords who are traditionally the biggest obstacles to industrialization. That didn't automatically lead to economic development, but created a condition. And then they also made various changes to organization of the government and social consensus to create a machinery that was able to deliver this. I mean, this is admittedly far more difficult than designing the right policy, with the appropriate incentive and conditions. But you have to think about them. Now, I mean, at the first level, the policy design level, I mean, it's very easy to give advice. But at the deeper level, it's quite tricky because you really need to understand the history of the country and understand the current political alignment. Basically, only people from those countries can do it, yeah? Because outsiders really don't understand. Yeah? And this means that all this external advice given by the World Bank and the IMF were frequently unworkable, even though the policies might have been reasonable, that might have completely misread the domestic political situation. And it's one reason why those external advices often didn't work.
Yes. How do you expect the dynamics of the debate to change if you shift the focus from developing countries to developed countries between like protectionism and free trade?
Yeah, what I'm advocating is what I call asymmetric protectionism. So if you are the poorest, you should be allowed to protect as much as you need. Yeah? As you develop, you should protect less. You know? It's like raising a child. I mean, when it is very young, I mean, you give it all the protection that you can. Yeah? As the economy develops, you want to remove some of these protections and encourage more independent existence. Yeah? So this means that the richest countries should have the least amount of protection, but I think they are also entitled to have some protection. I mean, we in other lectures already talked about how some countries are protecting farmers, even though it's very costly. There are many good reasons to do that. Even the richest countries might be exposed to some kind of external shock because, say, an industry suddenly collapses, and then you have to do something about that. I mean, you don't want to give permanent protection, but the industry might, the protection of, 5 years, 10 years before it can restructure, shed what it needs to shed, and reinvent itself. Yeah? So, I think even in the developed countries, the protection is justified, although in general, I would say they should be allowed to have less protection than the poorer countries.
As you summarize in the lecture, the discussion of the development has been concentrated trying to explain which countries' characteristics are related with development or not. But as you mentioned also in the first lecture, there are some theories that has been analyzing country development more like a relationship between countries and not more like concentrated in country level. Mm-hmm. Like Latin America structuralism or the dependence theory of the work of Samir Amin in Africa. So I was concerned, or I would like to hear your opinion of how these theories are useful to explain development, or how these theories have to change to explain development today.
Yeah, no, I didn't have chance to go into those things. As you said, there have been many theories, mainly coming from the developing world, explaining how the very structure of the world economy becomes an obstacle to development in the developing countries. And yeah, I mean, there are some problems with those theories, but I think the basic insight is correct. Yeah? Especially if you look at the way the global governance system have been reorganized since the mid-1990s, the rise of the WTO, the introduction of what is known as investor state dispute settlement mechanism, which basically unprecedentedly gives the right to corporations to directly sue governments for reducing their profit by introducing some regulation in some international tribunal overseen by the World Bank. They don't have to go to the national court first before it takes they take it to some international tribunal. They can directly go there, and this has hugely increased corporate power. Lots of countries have forced or seduce developing countries to sign these free trade agreements, bilateral investment agreements, which are lopsided. So yes, I mean, this international structure is having a huge effect on what developing countries can do in terms of their development policies. So, I think the problem with all dependency theory was it was too rigid. I mean, it was saying basically developing countries are prisoners of the global structure. They cannot break out of it. No, they can. Korea did, Taiwan did, but they are right in saying that these things are not purely domestic. There are these international structures that constrain what national policies can be, and yes, that we need to pay. I mean, I mentioned them briefly, but we need to pay more attention to them.
I just wanted to ask you about Brexit. Do you think it would be in the UK's economic interest in a post-Brexit environment to reduce tariffs and shift towards like free trade, like unilateral free trade? Do you think the UK could benefit from this sort of policies, or?
Well, according to standard economic theory, what you have to do is unilateral liberalization. I mean, it doesn't actually recommend striking these individual deals. So, yeah, I mean, at that level, that probably is better to have freer trade with the whole world rather than just with European Union. But having said that, in terms of manufacturing industries, Britain is already very, very unprotected. I mean, there isn't that much tariff to reduce. I mean, if it exceeds the EU, I mean, the only area where it can significantly reduce tariff is some parts of auto industry. The EU average tariff for auto industry is around 10-15%. But in other sectors, it's like 1%, 2%, 3%. Doesn't make a difference. The real issue about Brexit, I think, is really in the service sector. Is Britain going to be able to have access like before to the European financial industry? Yeah, I mean, that is the crunch thing. I mean, the merchandise trade is now irrelevant because except for one or two sectors like automobile and textile, tariff is very low. You cut it from, I don't know, 2% to 1%, people wouldn't even notice.
I was wondering if you could say a word about the shifting importance from tariffs to so-called non-tariff barriers, especially in the context of developing countries, where it's more likely that fully developed countries will have non-tariff barriers on goods and services.
Yeah. That's right. No, despite their free trade rhetoric, developed countries have used a huge range of protective measures. So tariffs are most visible, so they have been very willing to cut tariffs to show that they are really committed to free trade. But even within tariff, they tend to have a high tariff for basically industries where there's a lot of developing country exports. So, for example, if you are exporting raw palm oil to European Union, tariff is close to zero. If you export processed palm oil, the tariff goes up to like 15%. There are still higher tariffs on labor-intensive industries like textile and garment and shoes than in, say, pharmaceutical or aircraft. So the one paradoxical result of this is that developing countries are paying a lot more tariffs to the rich countries than other rich countries do. So Bangladesh, because it mainly exports things like garments and so on that have a relatively high tariff to the United States, actually pays more tariff to the US Treasury than France does. Despite the Bangladeshi economy being something like 3-4% the size of the French economy. Because for things that France exports, the US has virtually no tariff. for things that Bangladesh exports, there are tariff for 14%, 11%, 10%. On top of this, what the specialists call tariff peaks, these countries have used so-called non-tariff barriers to restrict the imports. So you put conditions on the sanitation, which are quite stringent. And if you're a poor developing country, you cannot really meet them. So you can export, even though the product is there. There are other non-tariff barriers. We cannot go into them, but so in this kind of way, the developed countries have protected the sectors that they want to protect. So you also need to expose this double standard, because they keep saying that we have liberalized our trade, but they haven't liberalized completely, and especially they have not liberalized sufficiently when it comes to industries that matter for the developing countries.